And what's amazing to me about this concept of thresholds is our brains are so willing to learn. They are so plastic that our brains will learn whether we give it in a 100% intensity or like a 15% intensity. And I think sometimes we forget that our brains will still learn at 15% intensity.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
like it will not diminish what we're doing, and that the minimum is still momentum.
Yeah.
Then I think the other really important thing that when we do exercise a habit, even and maybe especially when it's at the minimum, we celebrate it.
Hey, you found yourself in The Groove, a podcast where we create space for reflection and conversation to unfold. We explore the human experiences that connect us all to deepen our understanding of ourselves, our connection to the world, and the ways we engage with the aliveness within us. We're glad you're here.
So here we are back for the second part of our two-part episode here. So we're going to skip the intros, Carly, because people heard the first part. They know who we are, and we're just going to get right into some stuff. I think one of the really interesting things as we're doing this podcasting is in between podcasts, we kind of talk about a bunch of different things before we record the next one. And the team had a lot of conversation about what happened in part one and, you know, where we might really go in part two. And one of the things we really talked about during that is the application of setting up habits in the most effective way. And so interestingly, as we were talking, one of the things that came up is how you approach habits and how you've been approaching habits. I know you're giggling. And so let's talk about that. How do you typically approach habits?
So I had kind of this understanding of habits a few years back of these very like rigid structures. And it just never resonated with me. I was like, I'm just not that guy. Like, I'm just not the guy who's going to go through the checklist of habits of each day. And I kind of had this moment of like, oh, I don't need to engage with habits like that. Like, this is a choose your own adventure, in my opinion, in my own brain. And I started really looking at habits as like rhythms more than checkpoints, I guess, in my day. And for me, a habit is something that helps support the music of my day, but is not the music of my day, if that makes sense. So it creates containers for the flow to happen within, but isn't necessarily the flow itself. So I look at habits kind of separate from the juice and more as the cup.
Yeah. How did you used to? Because you're talking about you used to see them more rigidly and then you've switched it. So when it was more rigid, what did it look like?
It was a little bit more of a grid-like structure, I guess, if I can explain it that way, where it was like, do the if A, then B, then C, then D. Like, it kind of had this order of operations. And for me, a habit became something like, well, if I don't do the habit, then I can't do this other thing.
You were using it as a reward system or setting up a reward system?
Yeah, setting up a reward system, something to measure myself against, I guess. Like, for example, if I didn't do the habits of like my chores, then it kind of got into this loop of, well, if I didn't do my chores, then I can't do the things that are fun. They became things to judge myself against if I had completed the habit or not for the day based on the goal that I had set out to do, instead of habits as something that open up time and space.
Yeah.
They felt very restricting.
We talked in the first part of this about the friction, and that certainly created a lot of friction for you. So as you approach your habits now, and we talked a lot in the first part of this podcast about, you know, what habits are, and we talked a bit about structures, you know, what the cue is, what the response is, what the reward is, and the continuum. We're going to dig into that a little bit more explicitly on this one. How do you see the way that you approach habits now in that structure that we described in the first part of this podcast?
So now I see habits as something that can bring me into alignment. I've made sure that the habits that I start really engaging with are all ways of creating this feeling of flow and motion for me. And once I was able to look at habits actually as like freeing structures, a lot opened up in the way that I engage with the habit that I was trying to bring into my life, where I kind of realized, oh, the binary that I'm putting on myself of this habit isn't a true binary. There's always like the secret third option that actually probably has a lot more alignment for me. Whereas instead of using a habit to mark my progress, the habit just holds space for the progress to happen. Does that make sense?
It does. And it's a whole different way of looking at it. When I hear you say that, it's so much less about the checkoff that you described before. Did I do it? Did I not do it? And much more of, is this something that's occurring in my day that allows me the space to be able to accomplish or do the things or have the space and time to do other things versus I only get to do those things if. So it's just, you're coming from a different approach.
Yeah, and I think I got to right size what the habit looks like for me in my life. And like, for example, making my bed. Like, the habit of making my bed didn't have to be this massive endeavor where like everything's tucked in perfectly and like took a lot of time and energy out of my day to achieve this habit. I was like, all making my bed has to be is pull the sheets up and set the pillows back up. And then it became a habit that actually created more space and energy because I wasn't expending extra time and energy and mental energy on something that didn't actually bring me that much joy.
Yeah, or bring you anything more than what doing it the way you do it now does.
Exactly.
So it's that, what the good enough threshold versus it being perfect and having this ideal look.
And we only have so much time and energy in the day that I kind of got to this point where I was like, where do I want to spend my time and energy? And then once I kind of got really clear on my priorities of, okay, I want to spend as much time as I can creating. I want to spend as much time as I can connecting. And yet it is still important for me to have my space feel a certain way. I was able to kind of prioritize the way in which I engaged with these habits and like really right-sized the intensity of these habits in my life.
Yeah.
Or even like then was able to kind of be like, okay, if I spend an hour food prepping, that's going to save me X amount of time in my normal routine to engage with these other things that I really want to do. So it became way easier for me to build this habit, knowing the freedom it was going to create in the long run, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. So you really, in the end, thought about, what do I want these habits to do for me?
Exactly.
What's the end game here? Why is it important to make my bed? Or to do anything, really? Like, why is it important for that to be a habit? What will it offer me that is really important to me and that aligns?
Yeah. So like, here's another example. Like, I really enjoy taking good care of myself. And to me, that means eating nutritious foods and like mainly whole foods and mainly home cooked meals. That's also something that takes a lot of time and energy. And I was like, okay, how can I create a habit that might be a bit more of a lift in one moment that then opens everything else? And so it was like, how can I make this habit really work for me?
Front loading the habit so that it creates more space, or like front loading your time in a way. Yeah.
Because for me, it's really easy to, and I think for a lot of people, when it's a habit that you enjoy engaging with, like, I really enjoy making art. That's a habit that I don't even have to think about doing. Like, I'm just going to go do it. But if all I'm doing is making art, then I am not doing other things that I need to do to take care of myself. So I was like, what are the habits that can most support it in a way that feels aligned?
It brings me to why we choose the habits we choose. Some habits, I think, we become ingrained for a variety of different reasons. Like when you're growing up and your parents tell you that you need to brush your teeth, and every night you brush your teeth and they make you do it, And so it just becomes a habit. At some points in your life and with certain things, you need to be really conscious about what habits you want to create, because you're creating habits no matter what. And so there does come a point where it's like, wait a minute. Are the habits that I'm creating really serving me and serving what I want my life to look like and what I want to have in my life? Or are they just habits that have kind of crept up on me because that reward system for it is really easy and quickly gratifying?
Right.
You know, like I think of how it's easy to scroll on your phone on a social media site and the rewards are so quick. Like it just is so quick.
Yeah.
And so it's easy for that to be a habit without you even really thinking about it. And the question is that a habit that actually is supporting what I want in my life and who I want to become and how I want to live?
It makes me think of this concept of like everything has a tax. Like and it's okay that there's a tax. It's not in a bad way. But like, as I was thinking about some of these defaults that I was falling into, I was like, am I okay with the tax that I'm paying in this? Or would I rather pay a different tax to have a different outcome?
Yeah.
And like, for example, one of the things that I'm really working on right now is like giving myself like an hour before I touch my phone in the morning, which sometimes it lasts an hour and sometimes it just doesn't. But it's like the bare minimum that I can do is not look at my phone for at least 10 minutes after I wake up. For the beginning of it, I kind of had to accept the discomfort that I was feeling and like really notice like, whoa, why do I want to open this app so quickly right off the bat? It was almost just I woke up and like I would spend time just like checking some stuff on my phone. And it's like, ooh, what's the tax that I'm paying here? Am I willing to pay this tax? And is there a different habit that I can engage with where the tax is going to be different? Like I'll have to pay something else and it might be uncomfortable, but it might be worth it in the long run.
Yeah.
And once I kind of phrased it as like, okay, I can accept that there's always going to be a tax to pay.
Yep.
Now I can just choose the tax that I want to pay. It became much easier to change and identify the habits that needed to be changed.
Yeah. I love that. At night, sometimes one of the habits I want to change and what we're really going to talk about. Okay. So now what do? You know, you want a new habit. What is it going to be and why? And we're going to really dig into that. But I think of sometimes, especially during the week, you know, I get home, I have a pretty long commute and I make dinner or have something to eat and I end up sitting down on the couch and then I'm in front of a screen, whether it's the TV or my phone. And it's just this, I don't have to be responsible for anything, I guess. It's not a habit that serves me. It's an easy habit and they're really quick. Like I get a really quick gratification of it, I don't have to think about anything. I can just be in my own little world and in my own zone. And when I think about it and who I really want to be and how I want to see myself and how I see myself, it doesn't align with that. And so I want to stop doing that. And that's also really interesting because sometimes we know we want to break a habit. And that's a habit I want to break. But the question is really, in the first part of this episode, we talked about focusing on what you want instead of what you don't want. Breaking a habit you don't like is really expressing what you don't want. And so, like, I'm thinking about for that, what is it that I really want to have? And why am I doing it? You know, and I think one of the reasons I'm doing it is because I want this full sense of rest. And to just let go of any responsibilities. And so, yeah, that I don't feel good about it, you know, at the end of the night.
Like sitting in front of a screen does not bring you the rest that you're looking for.
And so, you know, what would bring me that rest that I'm looking for? If that's what I'm looking for, what brings me the rest? Even as we're talking this out, I'm like, wah.
One of the things that, before you go on, that I noticed that you didn't do was shame the way you were feeling about this. Or shame that you were sitting in front of the TV or are sitting in front of the TV or a screen. And it's not you saying, this wasn't good enough for me. It's saying that I'm worth spending my time in a way that feels better.
Yeah, and that it's not really giving me the rest I want. I actually feel a little more restless.
Totally.
So in this part of the podcast, we want to talk about structures. And I think knowing what it is you want from the new habit is really important. So like I think of this one and I want to feel rested and at rest from what I do after dinner and for those last 2 hours of the night before I get ready for bed. So I think, the first part of the structure when you're doing a habit is really understanding what it is you want from it. Like if you peel away all the layers, and sometimes it takes several whys. Like, what do I want from this habit? What is it I'm hoping to gain for my life and for my existence is a really important part of developing a habit. And so I think as you're listening and you're thinking of habits in your own life and what you really want to have as part of it to answer that question, I think that's a first, probably really important part of it. And then, when we talked in the first episode or the first part of this episode about the cue, the routine, and the reward cycle, but I want to get into that a little more deeply and applicably about what does that mean if you're trying to set up a new habit. I think one of the most important things that when you're setting up a new habit to recognize is that your habits have triggers or cues. So like I was talking before about sitting on the couch after dinner. So the trigger for that is dinner finishes, everything gets cleaned up. Those are habits. And then I sit on the couch and I turn on a screen. That's like the sequence of habits that I do. And so the cue, there are a couple cues for me. One is dinner's over and cleaned up. And the second is I sit on the couch. And any habit has a cue. Like if you look, anything you do. And so now I'm thinking about, so how do I reshift and use the cues to serve the rest that I really want and what's already in place? Because there are some habits that are already in place that I could work off of. There are 5 different types of triggers that actually trigger a habit, right? We call them cues, and they're the things that you do that spurs the habit happening. They are time, location, a preceding event. I just talked about the idea of I have dinner and then I clean up after dinner and then I sit on the couch. So those are preceding events that are part of my habit. Your emotional state and other people. Really digging into those cues, because sometimes more than one of them are part of why you do something. It's not just one single cue, can help you to frame out how to engage in your next step, really. What are you thinking about? What questions do you have?
Actually, no questions. I'm totally with you. What I was starting to think about, zooming out, is as you were saying, what you're kind of playing with is how important it is to set up our spaces and our rhythms to support the ways we want to shift our habits.
Yeah.
That's actually what I was thinking about. And like, for example, as you're saying, I want something more restful, is literally like, how do we create spaces that invites us to engage with that more deeply to support the habit being built? And like I was thinking, okay, if that means doing a puzzle, like having the puzzle out consistently, if that means reading, that your book is always in view, if that means that the screen, if I know about myself that if I'm in a room with a screen, I'm going to look at the screen.
Yeah.
Like creating other spaces that are really inviting for me to engage with this habit. That's actually what I was thinking about.
That's location.
Right. Yeah.
Right. That's one of so even as I'm thinking about this new habit that I want to create that will give me the rest that I want and that I'm looking for, I may need to shift the location because the location in front of the screens, like it's just, that's the habit. That's the location that triggers turn on a screen. And maybe I need to sit in a different room so that I can do something that is restful, but more fulfilling,
Yeah. And I'm also thinking about how when we build habits, we're literally asking our brain to create new neural pathways. And that it's a big lift for our brains to do that. And they're very, very capable of doing it. A habit is like this perpetual invitation to deepen this new neural pathway, and that our brains are really good at like linking things together. So I started to think about this concept called habit stacking and how that might really play into, I don't want to say like gaming the cues, but basically gaming a cue so that it's easier for you to follow and for your brain to keep making, or our brains to keep making a new neural pathway.
Yeah. It's the preceding event.
Yeah.
So that is what the stacking is, right? So you pair the new habit with something you already consistently do so that it's not out of nowhere that you're doing it. It's really connected with some other habit that you do. So, you know, like if you make tea every morning and you want to start this habit of writing in a journal, right? When the tea that you make every morning is already there, I'm going to have my journal near my teas.
Yeah.
And then I just have to pull my journal as I sit down with my tea. So it's you're setting yourself up for that.
I'm thinking a lot too how as we start to engage with new habits, it's such an invitation for deep present moment awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of this opportunity to look as an observer at our life. Yeah. And like kind of start to find these patterns and nuances and ways that we can weave things in a way that makes sense and feels really supportive. And I think sometimes we will look at habits, or I'll look at habits as this like big change that needs to be like inserted into life and has to almost be disruptive. But it's like, what about habits that actually just kind of are woven into our lives in the next step, or
in a
as
softer
the next
way,
step?
I guess.
Yeah.
Instead of a rigid way. Okay. So we actually touched on a couple of the triggers. You know, one is stacking or the preceding event. Another one is location, where I talked about my part on that. I think there are a couple other that are really important to address. Like one is time. And it's a lot of times these overlap. So time, like when I'm thinking about what I talked about before, is knowing that there's a particular time of day for this, right? And it's after dinner. So it's somewhere around 6:30, 7 o'clock. That's the time that also is part of triggering this. And so I think just knowing the timing of it is really important. There's also, they intersect the emotional state. My emotional state when I turn on the screen is fatigued. Yeah, I guess that's the best word, is fatigued. That's my emotional state that triggers me to do that.
Wait, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
When you're in that space, are you able to accept that you're fatigued, or are you looking to escape the fatiguedness?
Oh, I think I'm looking to escape it.
Yeah.
And I think I brought up rest before. I want a way to rest. And that's because of the fatigue. And I guess if I really accepted the fatigue, then it would be easier to find a way to rest. But I'm trying to chase away the fatigue. And I guess then I'm sort of doing something.
Yeah.
But not really doing something. But I think that's a really, like, what you resist persists.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think sometimes when we don't accept the emotion that we're feeling,
we try to cover it with something.
We're trying to cover it. We're trying to find relief in some way. And what would it feel like to invite a habit that accepts the fatigue and holds it?
Yeah.
And I don't know what that habit would be.
Yeah, I have some ideas.
Okay.
And yeah, this is such an important piece of this, is how you're feeling and what you want to be feeling.
Yeah, actually, I'm really intrigued by this now, because like one of the things I'm realizing is habits really changed for me when I no longer used them to try to change how I was feeling, but to support the acceptance of what I was already engaging with or already feeling, and as a way to flow with it.
Yeah.
Rather than try to flow against it. Because I think sometimes we use habits as a way to like rigidly move away from something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other cue, before I talk a little bit more about my ideas about what I would do,
I hear that.
is the other trigger can be other people. So, you know, if you sit down in the living room and it's engaging in a way with somebody else, like your spouse, and that's what we do after dinner. That's the other people trigger, so this is what we do. So I think for me, when I think of the cues for what I'm currently doing, there's a time component, there's a location component, there's a preceding event component. Like there's a lot to this. There's an emotion. I think they're all present, the emotional state component, and then what other people are doing. So it's really interesting that as we're talking this out, that I'm realizing that habit of mine includes all 5 of those cues. And so now it's how do I use, and I don't have to use all 5 of those, but how can I use these cues to create a new habit that would really honor the fatigue and bring rest. And so I guess what I'm thinking that the habit I would want to create is, I think, a combination of a small amount of journaling and then just a meditation practice. Yeah. So that's the habit that I would really want to engage in, that I think would bring me some rest.
Okay, so let's play with this idea of this habit that you want to bring in. I think sometimes we don't use the malleability of a habit to its fullest extent. Like sometimes we forget to create all the space that a habit can envelop. And one way that I really think about this is through this idea of thresholds. And it helps me understand what a habit could be in more of a spacious way than in a this is what the habit would look like way. This is what success of achieving this habit would look like way. And we touched about it a little bit in the first part, but maybe we can play with it a little bit more here.
Yeah, I think it makes sense because when we're talking about how you actually apply it, we've talked about recognizing the triggers and then using. So now you need to use these triggers to create the new habit.
Yeah.
And once you're thinking about what's the behavior, what's the routine? Like I talked about meditating, writing and meditating, that would be the routine, right? That's the second part of the habit loop. And that's where I think there's this continuum and not just a all or none. Either you did it or you didn't do it, but specifically creating a continuum for the new habit you want to create. So like ideally, I'm thinking for myself, and this is a really important piece. And as the listeners are listening to this and you're thinking about a new habit, and hopefully even as we've been talking about habits right now, you kind of have in your own mind, what's a habit that I'd really like to bring into my own world? If I were doing this new habit in its ideal version, what would it be? And so I'm thinking to myself, if I were doing this habit in an ideal version, I would probably just write about a page of journaling. Yeah, I would say a page of journaling. And then my ideal for meditating, given where I am and what I'm thinking about, I would say ideally 10 to 15 minutes. That would be the ideal meditation length for me right now. So that's the ideal. It's so helpful to also come up with what's the bare minimum? Like, what am I so confident I will do that it will be impossible to fail?
Yeah, and it's okay that these are also almost silly and
like
how
tiny
little they
baby
are.
steps.
Like literally open my journal. Like
yeah. So if I were to go with what I am 100% confident I could do, even if I'm exhausted, like extra fatigued, I could write one sentence and I could meditate for just 2 minutes, really just breathe for 2 minutes. Like I know I could commit to that without a doubt. I could make that happen. It would work.
And what's amazing to me about this concept of thresholds is our brains are so willing to learn. They are so plastic that our brains will learn whether we give it in a lesson in a 100% intensity or like a 15% intensity. And I think sometimes we forget that our brains will still learn at 15% intensity.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
like it will not diminish what we're doing, and that the minimum is still momentum.
Yeah. It's still moving in the direction of exercising that muscle of that habit.
Yeah. Then I think the other really important thing that when we do exercise a habit, even and maybe especially when it's at the minimum, we celebrate it.
Yeah. Like, because I was exhausted that night. And even though I was exhausted, I wrote a sentence and I breathed in silence for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think when our habits become very aligned for our well-being, there's no, like, you weren't going to be better off for not doing it, not doing the minimum.
Right.
Do you know
right.
what I mean? Like, you can still celebrate the minimum when the habit, like when my habits are so aligned with serving myself that the bare minimum is still going to better myself, it doesn't feel silly to celebrate them anymore.
Right. Even if I exercise it in that most minimal way, I know that it's going to benefit me and bring me the rest that I'm looking to have. And it will compound. Even if it's only a little bit, it still compounds.
I think too, when I've done that, it becomes so much more of an opening process to keep playing in that habit space. I think about the phrase I heard of, like, don't shame the behaviors you want to see.
Yeah.
And like, I think this is something that happens often, and it can even happen with friends. Like, if I've heard in friend groups, like, there's a friend that doesn't often go out, and when they do finally go out, friends are like, oh, you're finally coming out with us. And it's like, okay,
never mind.
What's gonna make that guy want to come out more if you're calling them out in front of all their peers and like basically shaming them for the behavior that you were hoping that they would engage with? And like, we can see how ridiculous that sounds when we turn it outwards from ourselves.
Yeah.
But then why would we do that internally when we see the behavior that we want to see it occurring and we go, yeah, but it wasn't good enough.
Right.
Yeah, but I could have done so much better.
Right.
Yeah, but I know I have more in me.
Yeah.
Like, why am I going to give myself the celebration of this when I could have done more?
That also brings me to the idea that some days you will have more in you and other days you won't. And there are a lot of variables to anybody's day that will bring you to your ideal version of your behavior or routine or your very least version. You know, if you are a parent with young kids, you know, maybe one of your kids is sick and bedtime takes a lot longer than it typically does. And so having that space to sit down and breathe for a couple minutes or write in a journal, for example, is just not going to happen because life happens in between.
Right.
And then there might be other nights that, you
have like a whole hour to yourself.
And it just depends on what happens in your life and in any given day. And we're humans. There's so much variation that can be thrown at us.
And I think that variation is actually a way that we can really build trust with ourselves. Like, once we accept that variation is just part of this experience, then every time we navigate the variation and still honor the habit that we're building, we're also building trust within ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's get back to the ideal and the least. Because I think I want to talk a little bit more about what's in between. So first of all, there's lots in between, which is great.
Just kind of explored a lot of that. Yeah.
So now, as you're setting your routine, there's so much choice and flexibility.
And we love a choice.
Yeah.
Humans love a choice. There's actually like choice psychology of how much of something people need to see in order to feel like they have choice.
Yeah.
And are more likely than to engage with something that they see. Yeah. Whereas if they only have one option, they're less likely to engage with it. And if there's too many options, they also won't engage with it.
Yeah. There's also this space in the middle. Like, what's in between the ideal, if everything in your day goes exactly as you hope it will, which doesn't happen very often. But, you know, shit doesn't hit the fan either.
Right. It's just a day.
It's just a day. Like, what's in that middle space between those two ends? You know, so if I were to apply that to what I'm talking about, I would think what's in the middle is, a paragraph, a half a page of journaling and 5 minutes of meditation, like a 5 to 7 minute meditation. I think that's what's in the middle of those two polar opposites or binaries. And so that gives me this range of ways that I can engage with the routine that will work for me. So I think, I just want to recap for the listeners. Number one is the cue, knowing what are the cues that are going to help you remember your habit, because it's going to take a little bit of practice with those cues to do that. So for me, the cues are going to be the location, which is going to be in a different room than where I typically go. Another cue is going to be after dinner. And I think one of the things I'd like to add, I do this sometimes, is make a tea and to have some tea, because that would be part of that. Just
coziness.
To me, that's this coziness. Exactly. Yeah. So that's part of the cue that will help me. So it's during the week, it's after dinner, I've cleaned everything up, I make some tea. I have my journal in the room where I'm going to go. That's the location cue. And I'm going to sit in that room to go ahead and start engaging in my routine. And then the routine is going to vary and have that flexibility of what's the ideal, what's the minimum that I know no matter what happens in life, I can get that done, and what's in the middle of it. So now I have a range of forming that habit that will work. And as I say that, I think no matter where you are on that, you're forming the habit.
Right, exactly. That's exactly it. Like 15% versus 50% versus 70%. Like the habit's being formed.
Yeah.
The habit is being formed.
Yeah.
I think too, like when we break out of these two binary ways of engaging with habit.
And I just want to say that the binary way of engaging with a habit that we've thought about is either I do the 20 minutes or 15 minutes and the full page, or I don't do it at all. That's actually the binary, not the...
No, the least to
not
the most.
Correct.
Yeah. That there are so many ways of engaging with what we always joke is like, you've encountered a false binary. What's the secret third option?
Yeah.
And the secret third option is really just what's the nebulousness of all the other options that we haven't considered yet.
Yeah.
And that to me is just such a great illustration of breaking out of that binary and giving yourself the space to be playful and creative around other ways you can engage with it.
It's not an all or none. It's not this or that. There's this whole range in between. And I think that's also true of so many things in life.
Yeah. I also think too, like, that creates such an openness. Like, we're literally practicing being open to different ways of being when we allow ourselves to engage with any other way that this thing could unfold.
Yeah.
Like, we're literally creating space to learn new things even within that habit being formed. Because it might be like, oh my God, actually, like, this is my sweet spot. Like, this feels really, really, this is my ideal, actually. Like, this felt really good. And just by opening up that space and inviting that possibility, we let the habit become something that supports us without trying to force the habit into what we think is going to be most supportive for us.
Yeah.
And so as we talk about habits, I think we can't talk about habits and forming habits without also talking about the way we talk to ourselves and our own internal stuff.
Well, I think the first thing is paying attention to how you talk to yourself about it and stepping back and just being a noticer of it.
Self-observation without judgment.
You're just noticing, like, oh, I actually forgot to engage in this routine that I committed to, or I feel a little bit uncomfortable because I like the other routine, even though I want to change it. I was comfortable with that. I was in my zone. I knew what that was. And
that actually makes me almost think too, like, in the characters that I do in these TikToks or in these videos, that you do just hold the space for yourself to kind of like look softly and look with a little bit of just like compassion.
Yeah.
Of just like hold that space for yourself.
Yeah. Like you might for a little kid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as they're like moving through something or noticing something, you're not rushing to explain. You're not rushing to like make sure they understand what, like, the gravity of the situation or what they did or didn't do. It's just kind of like, yeah, that's just what's happening right now.
Yeah. I think there's almost, when you notice whatever you're thinking about or whatever you're feeling, really, is that you kind of go, I forgot to engage in that habit.
And even it's so funny, talking to ourselves in that way is a habit that we have to build.
Yeah.
Like approaching ourselves with curiosity in a way that is self-observation without judgment. That's a habit too.
Yeah.
And for so many of us, I don't think we've had the opportunities and spaces to practice that habit.
Yeah. And it goes back to, we may know we don't want to talk to ourselves like that, but how do we talk to ourselves? What do we want? So I think number one, what do we want in terms of how do we talk to ourselves? I think the first thing is observe, notice, witness what's happening or what happened. And then I think the second part of that is to coach yourself in a loving way, where you say, I completely forgot. Okay. So what's going to help me to remember? Or, okay, I sat down, now I remember, I can go do this now.
Yeah.
And what will better help me remember for tomorrow? So it's a really productive conversation that you're having with yourself and productive questions that you're asking yourself versus something that might be shaming you or judging you. So when I say, I forgot to do that, there's no judgment.
No.
And when I ask myself, okay, what can I do tomorrow to make sure that I stack these better? And maybe it's leaving myself a note somewhere or something like that. But there's no judgment in it. It's coaching myself. Just like if I were coaching a team and I'm trying to help them move somewhere and get better at something, I'm not going to shame them or judge them. I'm going to say, okay, here's what needs to happen next. And so I think that's part of the conversation that you start to build within yourself, is that productive mentor coach self that is going to help you move your habit forward instead of criticize you for the way you're engaging with your new habit and the mistakes that you're going to make, which you will inevitably make when you do anything new, including a habit.
So as people are listening and they're like, okay, yeah, that really sounds great. I'd love to be really gentle with myself. I'd love to be not even gentle with myself. I'd love to be the coach to myself. I'd love to hold the space for myself. I have no idea what that looks like, or I have no idea what I can do next, or I have the magic phrase to me that has been so helpful is take a guess. Let yourself take a guess what that could be. And I bring that up because so often I think we hold ourselves to the standard of having the right answer, especially if it comes to where we think we should go with something, that we put ourselves in a binary of we're either going to say the right thing or the wrong thing. And take a guess is the secret third option in that, where it can just slow down and be like, oh, right, let me invite myself back into curiosity.
Yeah. So you mean like if I say what happened there, like my first reaction might be, I don't know what happened. And it's like, well, take a guess what happened.
Right. Or, well, I failed. It's like, okay, take another guess.
Yeah.
And I think also like when we say be a coach to yourself, be a mentor to yourself, if you have no idea what that sounds like, take a guess.
Yeah.
Like let yourself...
Give it a try. Give something different a try.
Let yourself take a guess what it would sound like to have that like open-hearted leadership towards yourself.
Yeah.
And this is also where we don't learn in a vacuum. We have really great resources to even like characters that are really loving and kind, or mentors or teachers, and like take a guess what this person would say. Take a guess how I'd interact with this person.
Yeah.
Like let myself use my imagination to understand what that could be and then point it back towards myself. So when I started doing this, I literally had like a hair tie or a bracelet on my left wrist. And every single time I looked at it, I would do an internal check-in of like, what can I observe about myself right now without judging? And the more I did that, the more that neural pathway just strengthened to the point where I didn't need to look at the bracelet anymore. It just became like this kind of like heartbeat of like check-in. And it didn't feel exhausting and it didn't feel judging. It was just like when I'm calm even to start going, oh, I'm calm.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm relaxed.
Yeah. So you had this system for checking in. You know what I love about what you just said? This breaks my heart to say. I know people who have shared with me that when they were trying to break a habit, that they would wear an elastic band on their wrist. And if they broke their habit or didn't do the habit, like they would pull the elastic and let it snap. And I hear that, like when I hear, even hearing myself say that, I get really, I don't even know the right word, but it just feels so restrictive. And this is what we've been talking about. And that you're using a very similar resource, but in a very loving way. It's there to remind me to check in with myself. It's just so inviting and opening instead of restricting and controlling.
Yeah.
Which is the other way that I've heard it. This is a very different way for me that I do it. I love what you just shared. For me, when I need to notice something and like really be the observer of it, I will imagine myself like in a hot air balloon looking down at the scene and what's actually happening. Because it gives distance, and from that distance, you don't hear the chatter. Like if you're in a hot air balloon, you don't hear what the people are saying. You just see what's happening. And that vantage point, thinking of being in the hot air balloon, just watching myself, like what's happening, that it eliminates the chatter, and then I can become more aware of what's happening instead of caught up in the monkey mind of chasing around the thoughts that might be swirling around in my head.
What is your cue for getting in the hot air balloon?
When I notice I'm getting chattery in my head. So if there's a lot of mind chatter, that's probably the bigger cue, because that mind chatter comes from a certain feeling. So that cue of the mind chatter is like, okay, wait a second, step back. And that mind chatter is usually judgmental. Because I think if anybody hears this, they're probably thinking, oh yeah, that checks out. Like the chatter isn't usually wonderful.
Yeah.
It's some kind of judgment. And that's the cue for me. Like, whoa, wait a second. Pull yourself out and take a look from a wider lens.
And I think sometimes we think of judgment as like this big scary monster in our brains that like can overtake everything.
Yeah.
But when I'm hearing you say like, I'm using judgment as the cue, it kind of deflates it a lot. And it just becomes information then rather than a judgment.
Yeah. So I think it's so good you asked what's the cue, because that's part of the habit, right? So if you have a habit of judging yourself, or a habit of chasing your thoughts or whatever it is, then that is the cue for you to use a strategy like the one you're talking about, with looking at a bracelet or something that you're wearing and checking in with yourself or zooming out.
I think it's also really important that we create space and opportunities for us to engage with a habit that are kind of exciting and novel. And it doesn't have to always be exciting and novel, but I think when we can attach at least the beginning of a new habit into something that excites us, we're also starting to like use dopamine in our brains to excite, and not as a reward, but just like I think about how zoo animals need enrichment in their enclosure.
Right.
Like so humans need the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think as we build habits, if we can add enrichment to the habit, again, it's in that opening way rather than that
a restrictive way.
Or rewarding way, because I think that's also important, that it's not a if A then B reward.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you said that, because the third part of the loop is reward.
It is,
and
yes.
We're going to talk about that too.
But not in reward of like, you did the thing, so you deserve the reward. And maybe we can explore this a little bit. Like, how do we separate rewards from this idea of having to earn it or be worthy of it, or as something extraneous that's the reason we're working towards the thing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And the other thing that adds to this is the withholding of the reward is a punishment. So even though you might not be giving yourself a specific punishment, and I'm using air quotes for those of you who are listening around the word punishment, when we set up an external reward, and if we fail to meet the routine that we're expecting, the habit that we would like to engage with, the withholding of that reward is actually the punishment.
Yeah.
And that's an external reward. So, all right, recapping where we are, we've talked a lot about cues and what triggers your behavior. We talked about the routine itself and what you want that to look like, and the continuum of the ideal, the very least you could commit to, and somewhere in the middle. The third part of this loop that really needs to be considered is, what is the reward? Because there is a reward to habits. There's a payoff for every habit we do. And
even the ones that maybe don't serve us.
Correct.
Yeah.
There's a payoff. So when I talked before about, I sit on the couch and I scroll, the payoff is I don't have to be responsible for anything.
Mm-hmm.
The tax I pay is what I don't like. The tax I pay is that I actually don't feel rested.
Right.
And I don't feel good about having gotten sucked into my phone or stupid TV show or whatever it might be. I want the payoff to be something that's more internal for me, and sometimes I think the hard part, the habits that are easiest to form have this immediate gratification and this immediate payoff, this immediate reward. And we've become really accustomed to that. And I think it's really important to consider look at reward as something that's a little bit more long-term. Like, I think about my habit of getting up in the morning, and within an hour after I wake up, I work out, period, the end, it happens. Whether it's something really small because of the way my day went or my day started, or it's a more ideal version of my workout, it happens. And for me, the reward of that, there's a couple of them. One is I look back and I go, yeah, I did that. I do that every day. And I feel so good when I do it. Like, it feels good for me. It feels good physically to move my body like that. And it feels good mentally to sharpen and clear away any of the morning fog or whatever's happening. It just feels really good. So when I think of this habit that I'm shifting to, which is to do the meditating and the writing after dinner with my tea, the reward, I think, is I automatically feel more settled. Like, there's a settling where the screen time, there's a fizz to it. There's this energy that just fizzles and fizzles and fizzes, where thinking about meditating and journaling just is like this settling.
Yeah.
Like,
And it's learning to trust that the settling will come. The fizz is instant.
Yeah.
The fizz is almost always available.
Yeah.
But trusting that by not engaging with the fizz, by moving towards something that's a little bit deeper, more of a long-term delayed gratification, is deeper. And we have to learn how to trust that.
Yeah. Especially in today's world where so much comes instantly. And I think, too, some of the best rewards are actually include that delay of gratification. I think the other part, when I think of this, like what other rewards could potentially come from that, is just the ideas that can come from writing and from meditating that you have no idea what they're going to be. That's a reward to me.
That's really interesting, where habits that serve us may have rewards that we don't even see, but we know that they're there in some capacity. And part of the reward is the unfolding of it.
Yeah.
Or unfolding of those things to engage with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the other part of the reward when you take on a new habit is the confidence that you build in yourself that you can do the thing that you want to do. And I love talking about rewards like this, because these are the things on the inside. You can't take it away or give it. Like it's something that builds. It's a reward that builds. It's not a, here, you can have, no, you can't.
Right. Which I think is how we often think of rewards.
Right.
That they can be given and they can be taken away.
Yeah.
And what I love that you're touching on here is it's expanding this idea of reward into a structure rather than reward into a form.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Because form is external for the most part. When what we think of form is some kind of an external thing.
Yeah.
Where the true reward is what's happening on the inside of you.
Yeah.
This has been a great conversation.
This has been a really wonderful conversation.
I hope that listeners are just thinking like, okay, I know how to move this habit forward, and I have some things to think about that I can grab onto that will help me move this forward in a way that's engaging, opening, friendly, and forgiving.
Yeah. Yeah. And a deep sense of acceptance and spaciousness.
Yeah.
So next week, we're going to start exploring these concepts around discipline as a buzzword in our culture right now.
Especially as it relates, we're talking about habits, and so often we think about self-discipline when it comes to habits.
And then this word of devotion that I've just been really intrigued by lately, and the relationship between these two concepts. So I'm really excited to get to explore that with you next week.
Me too.
And you all as our listeners.
And our team.
Always.
Thanks for hanging out with us. Join us next time as we explore one of my favorite frameworks for engaging with our mindset and emotional state. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts, or you can find us on YouTube at The Gnarliest Carly and at In the Groove Podcast. We would love to hear from you in the comments, or you can email us your questions at podcast@groovespace.co. If you enjoy reading blogs and our innermost thoughts, check out the Substack at substack.com/@thegnarliestcarly. You can also find me on TikTok and Instagram at, you guessed it, The Gnarliest Carly. Until next time, take it easy. This podcast is produced by Carly Wannerhide and Christine Wanner. Directing, editing, and filming by Erica Paparella. Support, show notes, and incredible questions by Kristen Pepin. Audio mixing and mastering by Tyler Paparella.